Well done, choir. Well, friends, we are 47 weeks into our 50-week sermon series. We are in an interesting spot, though. For some of us, as we've been going through this journey, we remember the Old Testament with passion, and then we got to the Gospels. And when you get to the four Gospels, for a lot of us, we're like, all right, the meat and potatoes of the Bible, the part we were looking forward to. But then we come out of the Gospels, and we quickly go into Acts and Romans, and then we have a bunch of letters from this guy named Paul. And if we remember that these letters that we get from this guy named Paul, he was a follower of Jesus, but he wasn't one of the 12 disciples. And so when we have been in the Gospels, we spend time remembering that Jesus had a bunch of followers who went with him, who journeyed with him, who invested time in relationship. And then we remember this guy named Peter. He was supposed to be like the rock or something like that, the beginning foundation of the church. And then we get this Paul stuff, all this Paul stuff. And we almost get to the point where we forget that there was these apostles. And the Bible, the way we have it laid out, hits us with them. And so this week, we're going to start with some of this Apostle Peter work. I'm going to give you the Cliff Notes stuff, and then we're going to jump in. For those who are following along, we have the Apostle Peter. He's writing to us in the kind of mid-60s, around 64 with Nero in Rome. And I want to just comment on that for a second. For anyone who started their career at one point and are either now retired or soon to be retired, you probably know this. Did you do the things that you did the same way over the course of those 30, 40 years? Hopefully not. I've looked at things that are being done in construction. You think that we would just know how to build buildings. Building a house is building a house is building a house, right? We don't build them like we used to. Good, bad, and different. You look at somebody who teaches. Do we teach the way we used to? Having been a student almost 30 years ago, I can tell you my kids are learning quite differently. Not that teaching doesn't have some fundamentals that stick with it. But things change and people change. We change over the course of 30 years. And I tell you that because when we get this letter, what we have is not necessarily a changed person at the core of who he is, but the world around him has changed. And so he's addressing that differently. And so in the beginning, when we find Peter, we find him as this follower of Jesus, somebody who's not yet the rock, the foundation of the church. He has to have this instilled in him. And then as he develops and hones his skills, I am confident that when Jesus left this earth and he found himself in a leadership position, he wasn't quite ready for all the work he had to do. He had to learn some things along the way. He had to have a few mistakes once in a while. I can tell you as a pastor, I've made plenty of mistakes, and I will continue to do so. Whether how we decide that or not is up to the world, but we all learn as we go, and Peter has learned as he's went. The audience that he's writing to, Peter is writing to Jewish people who are spread out all over Asia Minor. He's writing to people he's gotten an affinity with, but those are the insiders he writes to. At the same time, during part of this work, he's going to advocate for bringing Gentiles who are outsiders into the insider language. And that's going to be important. We'll make sure we cover that in a little bit. He's going to speak about this hope that we find in Jesus. And when you look at how this book is, or this letter is broke out, we see that it has sections to it. It has a salvation section, and then a holiness section, a submission section, a suffering section, and a change section. In large part, I would say it follows a pattern of how we experience life in ministry. For many of us, we have a salvation moment. Either one that was like an aha moment, or one with the gentle realization that we have accepted our safety, our salvation, and our hope in Jesus. We have this moment of salvation. Especially if you had an aha moment, usually your salvation moment is followed up with now what questions. How many of you have ever joined a group and then you got really excited and then all of a sudden you said, I'll join you, now what? All right? You get the rules. As Christians, what we do is we have somebody say, I believe in Jesus, and we go, here's the Bible. Let's find out about what that means. That next section is learning about holiness. It learns about how to live in a good relationship. Most of us are working on those rules on a regular and ongoing basis, and he'll talk about that. And then there's this submission section. It's one thing to know how to live this life. It's another thing to do it. Because it's December and some of us look ahead, many people are looking forward to January right now, and we're going to do what we always do in January. We're going to start a diet. Anyone up in that boat? Anyone done this before? How many of you ever started a diet and then realized that instead of having one cheat day a week, you had 6 cheat days in a week? All right, I'm not alone. All right, we're doing well. Submitting to the diet is the day you realize that you had to put it right. Submission sometimes is the moment where you go, all right, my head and my heart are both in agreement that this is what we're going to do. Submission also with Peter's writing is not just about us submitting, but it's also about the submission that people are going through in this world. You see, he recognizes the hierarchy of things in his teaching. He recognizes that Rome kind of leads everything, and then there's people who are Roman citizens and who have power and authority and privilege, and then there are people who don't, and they live different lives. He talked about the family unit. In that day, it was a very patriarchal society. So in his church, there were many women who were a part of the church whose husbands weren't. And so he talked about the submission of the relationship there. And we're going to hit on that today. It's actually important for us to talk about it because he's defining it differently than we're used to. Then he talks about suffering. Many of us have a moment of suffering. I use that diet analogy because the time that I realized it's not a 6 cheat day a week diet, it begins to feel like suffering when you're eating nothing but steamed chicken, broccoli, and rice. How many of you think that's a fun diet? Been there, done that, right? And you suffer through it sometimes. And sometimes you do it because you have to. And sometimes you do it because you want the end results. But you learn that there's suffering. In his teaching in Peter, he'll also talk about the suffering that we endure because the world simply isn't fair. It's not just. There isn't equity in it. There's the brokenness of sinfulness in this world. And because of that, there is a lack of fairness. And so we will go through suffering. But we also take hope that in suffering there is a refining, a refiner's fire, so to speak, that purifies the silver, that strengthens and hardens us. Many of us who have gone through ordeals that we have either chose or have been forced upon us, we've gone through moments where we have truly tested ourselves. We go through a moment where we experience some form of suffering, and on the other side of it, usually, not always, but usually comes a better us. And that's where the word change comes in his sections. We experience true change where we now have lived experiences where we're not actually having to write notes to ourselves to remember to do the right thing. We're doing the right thing because we are changed people. We're living a better life. And so those are the sections that he breaks it out to. He speaks about submission to authority so as to share love and peace and strength in moments of persecution. He speaks about how suffering now can lead to salvation later. He speaks of suffering, hope, glory, and salvation as keywords. And just again, as that basic introduction, Peter knew from his time with Jesus that suffering would always be around the followers of Jesus. And Jesus is above any of the persecution, though. And we hold on to that promise until we see him again. Okay, let's jump in. Now, I want to start that this book, this 1 Peter, in large part probably could have been used as a syllabus on worship. It starts off with this open and this introduction, and it has this musical note to it, right? The rock of the church, the co-leader in Rome, he's writing this, and it's a circular that goes out to this group, and it opens up with a greeting and then a song of praise to the body. Right? A song of praise. When we have worship, we start with music. Why do you think we start with music? In part, we learned how to do it early on. In part because music sets the mood, it changes us, it enlivens us. It works with our feelings. If you come into my office, you can tell what kind of a mood I'm in based on the music that I'm playing. If I'm trying to get paperwork done, usually I have like a slow rock or a jazz or something of that nature on. If I'm in a mood where I'm kind of cantankerous, probably Nanette wants me to shut the door because the music's a little bit different, right? The music can set our mood. When you look at South America in the 60s and 70s, there was a liberation movement going on, and in that space of time, some of the groups that were rising up would sing in order to enliven the people so much so that in the moments of deepest persecution, they were ordered not to sing because the government feared what would overcome the people by the power of their singing. Music does something to our souls. It's why we have weekends that have cantatas for music. Why? Because we know that even if we aren't the totality of the music, music enlivens a part of us. And so he starts with a song. We start with a song because we're trying to enliven our spirits and waken our souls once more. And so Peter spends time with this little bit of a beginning song before he gets to the body of his work and that form of worship that we have gathered for. And in that beginning section, Peter also begins his work with an idea for us. And I find this to be a particularly helpful idea and a hopeful idea for the season that we're in. And an idea that the church always needs to be considering. He sees that in this work, that though there are Gentiles, though they are outsiders, they are now to be considered as those who belong to the family of Abraham. Outsiders becoming insiders. I love this notion because we wrestle with it all the time. How do outsiders become insiders? How do those who were at one moment either just not a part of us or even outright against us, how do they become insiders? All of us know that growing up we probably hung out with a friend or two that our mothers told us weren't great ideas. If you didn't hear that from your mother, you might have been that friend, just so you know. Laughing tells me you were. But for some of us, we're outsiders in the community and ostracized or separated. And that's a lonely place to be. As Peter wrote to people, though he was a Jewish insider, he was writing how Jesus modeled for him in the DNA of who he was and the minister and the leader that he became, that he would be somebody who pulled people in. When you watch the ministry of Jesus, when we go back to those Gospels, in that ministry, Jesus was always profoundly meeting those who were excluded from the community, the least and the lost. The sinners, the prostitutes, the tax collectors, the notorious sinners, however you define that, Jesus was meeting them. He would transform them, and he would welcome them into his family. When we welcome someone into our family, we are most intimately bringing them in. And so in the beginning of this letter, Peter is speaking to you and I just as much as he is to the church of his day, that the work of the church is to take people who are outside of the promise and to bring them in. And he'll use language and imagery and metaphor that helps us see it today, specifically the words of family. The words of family that he'll use later explicitly are powerful for us. When I think of family, I always think of like the nucleus family, the mom, dad, and children. And as a parent right now, I think about like the first time I saw my daughter, right? We adopted our daughter, so it was a kind of a quick ordeal. And I worried as we were flying out there, would I bond with this child so quickly? Because you know what? We didn't have 9 months to worry about it. We'd only been active for a few weeks on the search list, right? And as I saw her instantly, I knew that it was going to be good. But at the same time, I can tell you that the being family part is work. In the instant of knowing her love, I also knew that it was easy to love her in that moment, and it would become harder later. Why? Because babies cry and scream and make messes. And as kids get older, what do? They cry and they scream and they make messes. And you know what? Some of us as adults, what do? We cry and we scream and we make messes. Sometimes being with family is understanding that you have to be able to love the people who scream and cry and make messes the most with you. And yet you choose to love them because they have been moved from the outsider to the insider. Because God has a purpose and a plan for this family. And though you might be the most frustrated with those most closest to you, your purpose is to love them greatly. And so what Peter is doing in this introduction is getting us ready to sing this song of praise, that we have a new family and the language that he uses, a new family that is based on hope around Jesus, understanding that this new family is reordered and radically different than the family the world would depict. He uses imagery of Jesus returning as a king, but Jesus as a king is different than every other king in the world out there. This reordered, upside-down, inverted kingdom that Jesus would be a part of is one where instead of the king receiving everything, the king gives out everything. Where the king, instead of using you to possess his wealth, takes his wealth and gives it to you. Gives you blessing and love. And so then he breaks into his sermon. And this is where every seminary in the world must have gotten the idea that every sermon must have only 3 bullet points in the body text of it, because Peter does it here. God bless them all for figuring that out. I'm sorry, but my notes have 7 bullet points this week. We'll make it, I promise. It's not blasphemy. But in this moment in which Peter is writing after the introduction and trying to set the imagery for family, for the ex-outsider being insider, he takes more time to develop the family of Israel. That they are to leave behind a former life to make a new future. He acknowledges the journey in the wilderness. Who people are now in this new covenant, and this new temple is the temple found of Jesus, not of an earthly building, and how we are a part of the new priesthood that we have. In this first section, he's setting the biggest part of the stage. If you ever recall your writing in high school or college, you understand that you better start well to keep everyone engaged, and that's really what he's doing. He reminds us that when we find who Jesus is in that salvation moment and in the holiness process, we learn about living a life that is worthy of God's love and praise. And what we do is we leave behind the broken pieces of ourselves to make the fertile ground. And that this becomes a journey of faith for us. And just like the journeys of faith that the Israelites have always gone through, they include a wilderness space, a desert space, a hard space. And though that journey should have only taken 40 days, it took 40 years for that journey in wilderness space. It takes as long as it takes for us to go through it in order to understand the other side of it. In the season of Advent, we speak of 4 words. We speak of peace, hope, love, and joy. For us to be able to understand peace, hope, love, and joy is for us to have worked our way through the wilderness spaces in our lives and to find that that is the space that is the holy land that God is calling us to. And so in that first part, he's setting that stage for that journey that we will all go through. And in the wilderness space, there is the acknowledgement that wilderness space is not fun space. It might be exciting to go to the great sand dunes if you've ever been there sometime, but I don't think I'd want to live there. Why? It's wilderness space. It's dry space. It's desert space. The provisions are not great. In that space, there is suffering to be had. Peter reminds us that there's unjust and violence in the world around us. And he tells us that if we're going to experience the suffering of this world, we need to live in the way in which Jesus taught people how to go against this kind of injustice and suffering. It's not that Jesus tolerated the experience of it, but he didn't raise up violent resistance. Peter has to include this in his message because the inclination for most of us when we experience injustice and violence against us is to retaliate in kind. When we see how people who wanted to resist Rome, especially with someone as corrupt as Nero was, what we saw is people would raise up themselves in violent rebellion against Nero because they experienced violence against themselves. There is a phrase I love that is, hurt people do hurtful things. Instead, what Peter advocated for is doing what Jesus did. Jesus advocated that we who experience the power of those against us are to love our enemies as we love ourselves. That is truly a radical statement that he had to make in the face of the group. To be able to say that we're to love our enemies as we love ourselves is to say that returning violence with violence or harm with harm, it just hurts us all. But to love our enemies gives us the opportunity to transform them truly within their hearts. Because Jesus met us in our brokenness and rightfully loved us instead of harming us. Though we would lash out in our relationships beginning, we are to love people. In the section about suffering, he would speak about those who are in authority, and he said, if you are somebody who is in authority, you are to treat others and honor them as if they were Jesus in your presence and in your midst. If you were to have set out the best for him and the most of respect and love and honor for him, then you are to do that for those under your care. If you are somebody of means and privilege, or if you are a husband in a household, whatever it is that you are to do, you are to treat others with honor and respect. And if you are someone who finds yourself under the subjection of someone else, whether that is you are an outsider and you have a Roman leader, or in Peter's case in the church he was leading, there were many wives whose husbands hadn't trusted in Jesus yet. And he's told them, in those moments, you are to love them until they can love Christ. It was a hard commandment for many. And so he would speak of a future of vindication and hope, a reminder that God's intention for us is promise and faithfulness, and not isolation and brokenness. He would use the imagery of baptism, and he would speak of Noah being saved by the waters. If we remind ourselves of Noah being saved by the waters, it was a pretty extreme moment, was it not? Being saved by those waters meant the washing clean of the world, but there's a reminder in that moment that though the world was washed clean in that moment, when the waters receded, the stain of sin was still there. The brokenness of our hearts was still present, and we needed ultimately to have Jesus to find the peace of it. And even in our living now, even in our baptism, though our hearts are made clean, the stain of it is still on us, until that time in which Christ will return. The future is where our vindication is, he said. And so as followers, we are to look forward with hope. And though we face suffering, he spoke of that refiner's fire, like I said, an image used multiple times throughout the text of the Bible, a reminder that through the crucible of heat, something better is made. And though it may not be pleasant to endure the heat, it is for our good. We are finally to have a faithful mindset in Jesus, to acknowledge that there might be spiritual forces of wickedness and evil that influence our world and enact upon us. There might be those with differences that are political or ideological or spiritual against us, but we are to find our faithfulness in a mindset that Jesus had, one where we can see those who are against us and still love. Finally, in the conclusion, Peter brings it all together, and he says that he is writing to you from Babylon, though he's in Rome. The reason why he does this is because it's an Old Testament throwback. Being in Babylon is being away from God, being away from where you're supposed to be, but an understanding that God has always brought his people back from where they aren't supposed to be. And so in this text, what he does is he challenges us, the church, to work our way back to where Jesus most closely is and to help bring others along the journey to that promised land. In 1 Peter, we are to live in hope for the return of Jesus. As a church, I am challenging us in the reading of this text to be reminded over and over again of how we welcome the outsider's insider, how we take down the barriers that might infringe on ways in which others who are not yet a part of the faith might come in. That we do so joyfully, that we do so in a way that honors God, and that we remind ourselves that Jesus is with us in the midst. Let us give thanks to God for the lessons Peter has taught us. Almighty God, I give you thanks that your follower here, Peter, would become the rock of the church in struggling and trying times. And in writing to people of a distant time and space might actually still be writing to you and I. A reminder that he would meet us and offer us the salvation that we find in Jesus, and then wrestle with us with the questions of holiness, the questions of discipleship, the questions of true transformation and change. May we continue to wrestle with those questions as your church. May we continue to build up each other into family, those that we have chosen or been born into. May we continue as the family of God, the church here, continue to trust that your provision and your grace is more than enough for those of us who have gathered. and for all who you will gather in under the umbrella and the tent into the house of God. Amen.